A girl walks the streets of Hollywood Boulevard, dressed in bright clothes, lost in the crowd, invisible to the world. A rich businessman drives past in a shiny car, his life cold and empty despite all the money. When these two strangers meet, by accident a love story is born, one that would change cinema forever. That story was Pretty Woman, but what if I told you the dream didn't end there? That whispers of a sequel, Pretty Woman 2, still echo through Hollywood, stirring the hearts of fans who never stopped asking, what happened after the fairy tale? The year was 1990. Hollywood was searching for a fresh story, something bold, something different from the usual love tales. And then came a film about a businessman and a woman from the streets, two souls from opposite worlds who were never supposed to fall in love. Yet somehow they did. The film was Pretty Woman, and it didn't just tell a story, it created a phenomenon. Julia Roberts played Vivian Ward, a young woman who walked the sidewalks of Los Angeles, living a life full of struggle, yet carrying a smile that could light up the darkest night. She was vibrant, hopeful, and unafraid to laugh at herself. On the other side was Richard Gere, as Edward Lewis, a wealthy businessman, sharp, polished, and tired of his empty life filled only with deals and money. Their meeting was simple, almost ordinary. But what followed was extraordinary. When Edward stopped his car and asked Vivian for directions. No one could have predicted that this short encounter would open the door to one of the most memorable romances in film history. Their love story was filled with awkward humor, stolen glances, and the discovery that true connection doesn't care about wealth, status, or background. Vivian's carefree spirit broke down Edward's walls, while Edward's kindness gave Vivian a chance to dream of a better life. The film's heart wasn't just in its romance, it was in its message. It showed that love could blossom in the most unexpected places, that people could see beyond appearances, and that even in a city built on dreams and illusions, real emotions could shine through. That is why audiences around the world fell in love with Pretty Woman. It wasn't just a film. It was hope wrapped in a love story. But Pretty Woman didn't only win hearts. It broke records. Made with a modest budget, the film earned hundreds of millions worldwide, becoming one of the highest-grossing romantic comedies of all time. Julia Roberts was instantly crowned America's sweetheart, her smile and charm capturing the world. Richard Gere became the ultimate leading man, his calm intensity making him unforgettable. And at the center of it all was director Garry Marshall, the man who knew how to mix romance, humor, and heartache into a single masterpiece. What made the film so special wasn't only the romance, it was the transformation. Vivian was never saved by Edward. She saved herself with Edward by her side, choosing to love her as she was, not trying to change her. It was a modern fairy tale, yes, but it was also a story about dignity, respect, and finding someone who sees the real you when no one else does. The last scene, when Edward climbs the fire escape with flowers in hand, remains one of cinema's greatest endings. It was a perfect bow to a story that made audiences laugh, cry, and believe in happy endings. But as the credits rolled, one question remained in people's hearts. What happened after? Did Vivian and Edward's love survive? Did the fairy tale last beyond the closing scene? That question, lingering for decades, is what gave birth to whispers of a sequel, a dream that fans still hold on to today. Pretty Woman 2 became not just an idea, but almost a myth, a story waiting to be told. For years after the credits rolled on Pretty Woman, fans carried one question like a secret they couldn't put down. What if there was more? What if Vivian and Edward's story didn't end on that fire escape? What if the fairy tale continued? Hollywood, a city that survives on sequels, spin-offs, and reboots, heard those whispers. And soon rumors began to grow, rumors of Pretty Woman 2. In the early 90s, when the success of the first film was still fresh, talk of a sequel began. Studio executives, smelling the gold in the box office numbers, were eager. After all, how often does a romantic comedy cross $400 million worldwide? It was rare, and they wanted to strike while the iron was hot. The press whispered that Julia Roberts might return. Richard Gere could be convinced. And Garry Marshall, ever the magician behind the camera, might bring the magic back, but Hollywood dreams are fragile. Roberts, then a rising star, quickly became the biggest actress in the world. She won an Oscar nomination for Pretty Woman and soon after took on films like Sleeping with the Enemy and The Pelican Brief. She was no longer just Vivian. She was Julia Roberts, the Queen of Hollywood. When asked about a sequel, she often smiled, sometimes laughed, and other times firmly said no. For Roberts, Pretty Woman was perfect as it was. Why risk a second chapter that might never match the first? Richard Gere was no different. His career stretched into deeper, more serious roles. For him, Edward Lewis was a closed chapter, a character he loved but didn't need to revisit. Interviews from the 90s showed Gere brushing off questions about a sequel, often joking that Vivian and Edward had already lived happily ever after. Why tell the story again? And then there was Garry Marshall, the director. He loved Pretty Woman dearly, but he too understood that sequels often fail to capture the heart of the original. Yet Garry was a storyteller at heart, and he teased fans from time to time. In interviews, he mentioned ideas: what if Edward and Vivian had children? What if they faced real-world problems? He never promised, but he never completely shut the door either. That was enough to keep hope alive. By the 2000s, Pretty Woman had turned from a film into a legend. The rumors of Pretty Woman 2 became part of its mythology. Every time Julia Roberts reunited with Richard Gere for events or interviews, magazines lit up with speculation. Could this mean a sequel is coming? Fans dissected every smile, every hint, every line as though it were a secret clue, but the truth was harsher. Roberts said, in clear words, that she would never return to Vivian. She believed the story ended where it should, that the magic of Pretty Woman was in its timing, its freshness, its innocence. And to reopen that story, to create a second chapter, might destroy everything people loved about it. Richard Gere agreed. The fairy tale had already been told. Still, fans did not stop dreaming. Over the years, gossip columns claimed Pretty Woman 2 is in development. Some said Roberts had secretly signed on, others claimed Gere was ready, and a few even insisted there was a script locked away in a studio vault. Of course, none of it was true, but the rumors kept the dream alive. Then, something unexpected happened. In 2015, Garry Marshall released a new film, Mother's Day. He reunited Julia Roberts with him one last time. During press interviews, journalists asked the question again, was Pretty Woman 2 possible? Julia laughed, Gere teased, and Garry smiled. And then, only a year later, Garry Marshall passed away. With him, a piece of that dream faded, because the truth is this: Pretty Woman 2 was never just about Roberts and Gere. It was about the three of them: Julia, Richard, and Garry, their chemistry, their trust, their magic as a team. And without Garry, the heartbeat behind the film, the possibility of a sequel dimmed to almost nothing. Yet, even now, decades later, the whispers continue. Fans on forums write their own versions of Pretty Woman 2. Some imagine Vivian and Edward raising children. Others imagine them fighting to save their marriage, proving that fairy tales can face real-world struggles. Some dream of Edward losing everything, and Vivian becoming the strong one who lifts him up. Each idea, though only fantasy, keeps the story alive. And so, The Legend of Pretty Woman 2 is not a film you can find in theaters. It is a story that exists in the hearts of fans, in rumors and headlines, in interviews and half-smiles from Roberts and Gere, a sequel that never was, yet never truly died. Every great story has two sides, the one we see on the screen, and the one that quietly unfolds when the cameras stop rolling. With Pretty Woman, the behind-the-scenes reality was often just as fascinating as the romance we watched between Vivian and Edward. And it is within that reality that the truth about Pretty Woman 2 begins to emerge. The first truth was this: Pretty Woman was never supposed to be the sweet fairy tale we all know today. The original script was dark, raw, even tragic. Vivian was not meant to find love, but to be discarded once again, a reflection of the harsh world she lived in. Edward was not a prince, but a cold businessman who simply paid her for a week of company. There was no fire escape, no flowers, no promise of a better tomorrow, just a broken girl and an empty ending. But Garry Marshall, with his warm heart and instinct for magic, refused to let that be the story. He reshaped the film, softened its edges, and infused it with hope. He believed audiences didn't just want truth, they wanted dreams. He gave Vivian dignity, gave Edward redemption, and he gave the world a love story that felt timeless. Without Gary's vision, Pretty Woman might never have become the classic it is today, and so, when talk of a sequel began, the real obstacle was not Hollywood money or actors' schedules. It was something deeper, fear of destroying the legacy, fear of making a film that would never live up to the original. Behind closed doors, executives discussed numbers, scripts were toyed with, but Roberts and Gere hesitated. They had seen too many sequels collapse under their own weight. Why risk turning a masterpiece into a shadow of itself? Julia Roberts, known for her honesty, said it more than once. Pretty Woman was lightning in a bottle. It was not just the script or the acting, it was the time, the place, the feeling of 1990. To repeat that was impossible. She often reminded people that Vivian's story had already been told, from struggle to love, from invisibility to being seen. What more was left to say? For her, Vivian was not a character to revisit. She was complete. Richard Gere felt the same. In interviews, he admitted that he adored the film, but he didn't believe in continuing it. For him, the ending was already perfect. A man who learned to love, a woman who learned to believe. He feared a sequel would only tarnish what had been beautifully resolved. Then came Garry Marshall again. A man who thrived on bringing joy, he sometimes teased ideas for a continuation. He once joked that maybe Edward and Vivian's kids would be the focus. Other times he imagined a story where Edward had to win Vivian's heart all over again. But even Garry, with all his creativity, knew deep down that the moment had passed. The magic of 1990 could not be rebuilt in the 2000s or 2010s, and then fate sealed the question forever. In July 2016, Garry Marshall passed away. The man who gave the world Pretty Woman, who had turned a dark story into a shining fairy tale, was gone. With him, the dream of Pretty Woman 2 dimmed into silence. For Julia and Richard, who loved Garry dearly, the thought of doing a sequel without him was unthinkable. Their story was his story too, and without him it felt incomplete. Behind the rumors and headlines, the reality was simple. Pretty Woman 2 was never stopped by money, never blocked by lack of fan demand. It was stopped by love for the original, love for its legacy, and love for Garry Marshall, the man who made it all possible, but that doesn't mean the story was forgotten. While the sequel never came to life on film, the spirit of Pretty Woman lived on. Stage adaptations, television specials, and endless interviews kept the flame burning. Every time Julia Roberts laughed about Vivian, every time Richard Gere reminisced about Edward, fans felt the warmth of that world again. In the end, the behind-the-scenes truth is this: Hollywood may build sequels out of greed, but Pretty Woman resisted that fate. It chose to remain untouchable, preserved like a gem from another time. The story behind the curtain was not a failure, but of respect, a rare moment when actors, directors, and even a studio protected the soul of a film rather than stretching it for profit. And perhaps in that way, Pretty Woman 2 exists not as a film, but as an unbroken dream. A sequel that never needed to be made, because the story behind the story was already enough. Asterisk, what if the fire escape had only been the beginning? What if Vivian and Edward's kiss was not the end of the fairy tale, but the first chapter of a much longer story? For more than 3 decades, fans of Pretty Woman have asked these questions. They have imagined, dreamed, and debated what a sequel might look like. And though Pretty Woman 2 was never made, the idea itself has been reviewed, dissected, and rewritten in countless ways by those who never stopped believing. One vision of the sequel is simple: happily ever after. In this version, Vivian and Edward marry, start a family, and prove to the world that love can conquer the odds. They move beyond their differences, leaving behind the streets and the boardrooms, building a life where compassion and wealth coexist. It would be the fairy tale extended, giving audiences the closure they thought they wanted, a picture of happiness that lasted beyond the screen. But another vision is more complex. What if marriage wasn't the end, but the beginning of real struggles? What if Edward's corporate world clashed with Vivian's streetwise honesty? Would they fight to balance their pasts with their new life together? Would Vivian face judgment from Edward's world of wealth and power? Would Edward learn to let go of his rigid control and embrace Vivian's freedom? In this version, Pretty Woman 2 becomes less about fantasy and more about reality. A story of two people trying to keep love alive when the magic of the first kiss has faded. There is also the darker vision, one that reflects the original script's tone before Garry Marshall reshaped it. In this imagined sequel, life after the fairy tale is not perfect. Vivian struggles to adjust to Edward's world, and Edward, despite his best efforts, cannot fully change who he is. The film becomes a story of compromise, heartbreak, and perhaps even separation. A tale not of eternal love, but of what happens when two worlds collide and cannot stay together. It would be bold, raw, and honest, but would audiences ever accept such an ending after decades of believing in the dream? The truth is, each imagined version of Pretty Woman 2 carries both promise and danger. On one hand, a sequel could deepen the characters, giving audiences a chance to see them face the challenges of real life. It could show Vivian not just as a woman who was chosen, but as a woman who continues to choose herself, standing tall in a new chapter. It could show Edward learning that love is not a one-time rescue, but a daily act of courage and sacrifice. In the right hands, the sequel could have been more than a fairy tale. It could have been a story about growth, about the beauty and struggle of lasting love, but on the other hand, the risk was enormous. The original film was lightning in a bottle, a perfect balance of charm, humor, and heart. To return to it might have destroyed its legacy, turning magic into something ordinary. Sequels often stumble because they try to recreate a moment that cannot be recreated. Imagine Edward and Vivian, older, married, facing bills and arguments. Would it still feel like the dream that audiences carried in their hearts for so long? Or would it feel like an intrusion into a story that should have been left untouched? Even Julia Roberts herself once said she feared a sequel would only disappoint. Richard Gere echoed her thoughts, suggesting that part of the beauty of Pretty Woman was in its final frame, when Edward climbs that fire escape and Vivian's smile lights up the world. To go beyond that moment might unravel the magic. Garry Marshall, too, despite his playful teasing, never committed to a sequel, perhaps knowing deep down that the risk outweighed the reward, and yet fans continue to review the idea themselves. On forums, in fan fiction, and casual conversations, they keep the sequel alive. Some say Vivian and Edward's daughter should be the focus, a young woman finding her own place in a modern world, echoing her mother's struggles and dreams. Others imagine Edward losing his fortune and Vivian becoming the strong one who supports him, flipping the roles of savior and saved. Each idea, each imagined script, proves that Pretty Woman 2 doesn't need to exist on film to exist in spirit. So, how should we review the sequel idea? Perhaps it is best seen as a mirror of ourselves. The optimistic version shows our desire to believe in lasting love. The complicated version reflects our awareness that relationships require work. The darker version reminds us of our fears that not every fairy tale survives. In that way, Pretty Woman 2 is not just a film that was never made. It is a canvas onto which every fan paints their own ending, and maybe that is the beauty of it. The absence of a sequel leaves the story alive, free to be whatever the viewer imagines it to be. For some, it is eternal happiness. For others, it is struggle and redemption. For all, it is a reminder that sometimes the best sequels are the ones that never reach the screen, the ones that live forever in the imagination.